Welcome back. We are going to be looking at introduction to slope-intercept form, which is y equals mx plus b. So I know that we've been doing a lot of algebra this year, but now that we're pretty much at the halfway point in the year, we're actually going to be looking and shifting gears to graphing right now. Okay, so with graphing, there's a few tricks that I learned at a young age when I went to middle school at Chrisbell, and I'm going to share those with you because they're really helpful. Okay, so here we have the equation which your teachers have already showed you, y equals mx plus b. Okay, the m stands for slope, and the b stands for y-intercept. Okay, the m stands for slope, and the b stands for y-intercept. Now, here's the trick. A lot of people say to me, well, Mr. Landman, slope doesn't start with m, so why do we call m slope? The one thing that I was taught, which was very helpful at a young age, was think of slope, which you guys already know. Slope means rise over run. Your teachers already shared that with you. Think of slope, or the m to stand for movement. So m, think of that as the movement that occurs on the graph. The movement to get from one point to the next. From one point, you're rising and then running. Rising and then running. Think of the m, or the slope, as your movement. Okay, that was always very helpful for me. Y-intercept. Why do we call the b y-intercept? Again, you might say, Mr. Landman, why don't we call it the y instead of the b? So y-intercepts, as your teachers have already showed you in class, it's, quickly to review, it's where our line or our equation intersects the y-axis. So, and that is also going to be where you start your graph. When given an equation, you could think of b, or y-intercept, as your beginning. So y can be understood to be as the beginning point on your graph. And that was always very helpful for me. So m and b, your teachers and myself, we're going to constantly say to you, before you solve this, write m equals and b equals on your paper. And if you ever get confused between the two, again, think of m as your movement and think of b as your beginning point, or your y-intercept, where you're beginning. Okay? So just a few quick examples before we actually get into finding slope. I'm going to give you the equation y equals 3x plus 5. 3x plus 5. So again, the two important things that we have to start with is just being able to identify your slope, your m, and your b. Your teachers and myself are going to constantly say, write m equals and b equals on your paper over and over and over again. So again, your m, or your slope, is always located in front of your variable x. So what I like to do is I actually like to write the formula y equals mx plus b down right below the equation. So that way I can kind of just see where it matches up. My m is my 3, and my b, or my y-intercept, is my 5. So now we need to talk about a few things about standard forms. So m, which stood for slope, also known as movement, needs to be written in the rise over run format. So actually it needs to be written as a fraction. So here, how do you turn any whole number into a fraction? You take it and you simply put it over 1. It's the equivalent fractional version of itself. And now it satisfies a rise over our run, which is great. The second thing to note is the form that our y-intercept needs to be in is a form of a point. Again, remember, if you go back up here, it's the point at which the line crosses the y-axis. That's where it intersects the y-axis. So it needs to be a point. So if you're crossing the y-axis, it's always, your x is always going to be 0, and in this case, it's going to be 0, 5. So one thing that I wanted to point out is when you're writing your b or your y-intercept, the x-coordinate is always going to be 0. Very, very important. So now we're going to look at another example where it gets a little bit more complicated, but sometimes they're going to give it to you like this. Y equals negative 2/3 x plus 10. So in this case, again, we want to start by writing y equals mx plus b, so that way we can simply just fill in the gaps here. So we always need to write m equals and b equals down. Remember, m is always located before the variable x, as you can see in the formula. In this case, it's -2/3. And look at that. It's already in fraction form, which is a beautiful thing. Then one thing I do want to point out here is a lot of people get confused because they never know whether the negative sign needs to be on top with the 2, needs to be below with the 3, or needs to be in the middle with the fraction bar. And back in 7th grade, our 7th grade teachers actually showed us this and stressed this to us, which is, I'm going to remind you, that a fraction with a positive or negative in front, we can always rewrite it in 3 different ways. The first way, which we already wrote, is where the negative is on top. The second way is where we can actually shift the negative to the bottom. Or the third way is where we can simply put that negative smack in the middle of the fraction bar. And then your b is going to be 10 here. But remember, it needs to be rewritten as a point where the x is always 0, and then our b is the y coordinate, which is 10. Okay, so just to recap here, we need to always emphasize or stress the 2 important things with this lesson are that you need to always find slope and y-intercept, okay, which is the m, which stands for movement, and the b, which stands for y-intercept. And you always need to make sure that your slope is rewritten in fraction form. If it is a whole number, we could simply change it to a fraction by placing it over 1. And also that the b, or the y-intercept, the beginning point, needs to be rewritten as a point, okay, because it's a point on the graph. And then also that if you do have a fraction with a negative sign, it's also important to stress, as we did below, something we learned in 7th grade, either from Mrs. Tuthill or Mrs. Repke, and that is that we can rewrite the negative sign either on top of the fraction, on the bottom, or smack in the middle, and these are all equivalent. It will not change your answer or your work. Thank you, and stay tuned for calculating slope next week.